I'm going to talk about parapsychology and the ecological self tonight. So I'll share my screen and hopefully I can. Oh, it says host is disabled, attendee screen sharing.
Oh, marvellous. Okay. Right. Okay. That's a great start, isn't it?
Yeah.
Advanced sharing options. You should be a co host, so you should be able to do this. Oh, hang on. Sorry, Jack.
Okay.
Not quite sure what's happened there. Can you try again now?
I can try it again. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there, but. Right.
No problem. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, and you can all hear me okay? Great. Okay, yeah. So, parapsychology and the ecological self. This is kind of building on some of the ideas that I talked about the last time I did a webinar for ASSAP. I think I talked about an introduction to greening the paranormal, which is the title of a book that I edited in 2019, this book. And the book is really a broad exploration of the links between ecology and anomalistics. So ecology, very broadly speaking, is the study of the relationships between living organisms and their environments. So that includes, the way that living organisms interact with each other, like plants and animals, how animals eat plants and things like that, and other animals, but also how they interact with the non-living systems as well. I put non-living in inverted commas, like the hydro cycles, the gas cycles, carbon cycles and all that kind of stuff. So ecology is about this complex living system that our planet appears to be. And then anomalistics I've taken quite broadly to cover all sorts of different fields in the paranormal, from parapsychology through to cryptozoology, and I also include religious studies in there with anomalistics as well, because I kind of think of religious studies as the X-Files of the humanities, where they deal with all sorts of interesting paranormal, supernatural phenomena in the academy. So I consider that part of anomalistics as well. And of course, Paranthropology as well. So the book has got lots of different chapters by different authors who are all exploring these strands in their own particular way. So they all take them in different directions. So some take a parapsychological route, some go down a cryptozoological route, others adopt indigenous Native American perspectives. So it's quite an interesting collection. And this talk really is an expansion out of the introduction that I wrote for this book. It's sort of over the last couple of years, since I did my permaculture design course, I've been thinking a lot about ecology. It's really permaculture that introduced me to thinking about ecology deeply. And when I was doing that, I saw all of these connections with the things that I was researching in my PhD research on mediumship. So we'll get into some of those things as we go through this. Okay, so the talk that I'm giving really is somewhere around about the middle of this Venn diagram here. Okay, somewhere between anthropology, parapsychology, and something that is called deep ecology. Deep ecology is a sort of a philosophical movement, really, that tries to place put the human being back into ecology. And we'll see later on that one of the founders of deep ecology, a philosopher called Naess, thought that in order to develop this deep connection to the natural world, we have to develop a sort of an ecological self. So it's this idea of the ecological self that I think brings together these three different fields of research: anthropology, parapsychology, and deep ecology. So that's what I'm going to try and make evident tonight. So here's the overview of my talk. I'm going to talk about first of all, in terms of anthropology, different ideas about the self. What is the self? Taking a cross-cultural view of the self reveals some interesting things. Then I'll touch on the deep ecology aspect, think about what the ecological self is and some of the definitions of that idea. And then finally, the parapsychological dimension of this, I'll start off talking about Frederic Myers, one of the founders of parapsychology or psychical research, and his Gothic psychology, and then finally think about some more recent theorists. Okay, so that's broadly how it's going to pan out. Okay, so in anthropology, anthropology, broadly speaking, is the study of human beings, human cultures. But also, there are strands of anthropology that deal with human evolution, things like that. Understanding, human beings essentially. And if you look into the anthropology, or what anthropology has to say about the nature of the self, then usually you come to the work of Marcel Mauss. So all discussions about the anthropology to really think about this. You might know a little bit about Mauss, or you might not. He was the nephew of Emil Durkheim, who was many people regard him as the founder of sociology. So you may have heard of Durkheim, and Mauss was his nephew. And he was very influential in the early days of anthropology and ethnography or ethnology. Okay, so he really thought about what is this concept of the self. And his main emphasis was on this idea that the self is a cultural category, essentially. So that if you go to different cultures, each culture will have its own kind of model of what the self is. Okay, so essentially he's saying that the self is a sort of a set of beliefs or a set of ideas that we have about our inner kind of consciousness, I guess. But that these categories, these cultural ideas kind of crystallize in a way, so that you could be brought up, for example, in a Western context where you're taught that the Western idea of the self is, X, Y, and Z, and then that is how you experience the Western concept of the self. But if you go to another, culture, they have a different model of the self, and they experience the self in different ways as well. But we'll get onto that in a minute. So he talks about the evolution of this idea, and he builds up to, like a lot of academics from this kind of time period, he uses a kind of evolutionary scheme. So the earliest things are the most primitive, and it develops to more complex ideas, usually culminating with Western society as the kind of epitome of that development, which is a bit of a dodgy idea. But he starts off with this idea of the humans, of the subject. Okay, so this is our experience of being an embodied entity. So we all experience being in our bodies. This is the starting point. Then he talks about the role. So, we each have particular duties and responsibilities that we have to perform. And he argues that these cultural ideas about duty inform our models of the self as well. Then he goes on to talk about the persona, which is like the idea of a character that we play, that the self is kind of like a character. And then finally, he ends up with the notion of the Christian person, okay? And he thought that this was this was where we'd arrived at in the Western world, of the individual, of a single, the individual is a soul in a body. It's a singular thing. And, we survive bodily death and exist in the afterlife and that kind of thing. Okay, so this is how he saw the evolution of the idea of the self from this subjective experience through to a cultural model. Okay, so he finally arrives at this idea of the person defined as an individual, bounded, a psychological being. And this model of the self is usually found in modern post-industrial Euro-American societies, Western societies. Okay, another anthropologist, Melford Spiro, built on these ideas, and he suggested that there were three possible things to which the term the self might refer. It could be the psychobiological organism, so the whole of our bodies, in totality, bounded by the skin. Yeah, so the self ends at our skin. It could be our mental representation of our person, which would be our self-concept in our mind, how we perceive ourselves. And then he also talks about this idea of the self being a psychological entity, or an I, like the presence of of me, almost like a soul in a way, or an ego, that there is something that is me that is within here, and that is myself. Okay, building on these ideas again, different ways of thinking about the nature of the self. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz made a distinction between Western selves, which is kind of what I've just been describing, bounded individual selves, and non-Western selves. Okay, so for Geertz, the Western self was a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively against other such wholes and against its social and natural background. So he's saying that in the Western way of thinking about the self, we are individuals, we're separate from the environment, we have our own kind of motivations, we do our own thing. We're not a collective mind or anything like that, we're an individual. And this is, this has become the dominant view in psychology, a lot of psychology anyway, but also kind of like in the mainstream of Western culture. Although we'll see soon that there are also pockets of other ways of thinking about the self. Okay, so in the anthropologist Charles Taylor's terms, the Western self is buffered. It's like we've got a boundary between us on the inside and the outside world. And you can think about this in more broader paranormal terms as well. This might help us to understand why, things like ideas like telepathy and all of that kind of thing are so difficult for the Western kind of model of the self to accommodate, because the self is an individual and bounded. Whereas in other cultures, as we'll see, the self is not necessarily bounded. So telepathy and things like that are not necessarily seen as, impossible, which is interesting. Okay, so this non-Western self then is referred to as, or sometimes referred to as, Dividual. Okay, so you've got the individual that can't be divided up, it's a single whole. And then you have the Dividual, which can be made up of many different parts. And it really comes from the work of an anthropologist called Marilyn Strathern, who did work with, I think it was Melanesian people. And she noted that amongst these people, their concept of the self was much more porous, permeable, much more kind of socially oriented than the Western self, which was very individual. So for these people, the self was made up through, the social interactions with other members of the family. Yeah, so the self isn't just a single individual thing, but the self is actually made up of lots of different components. So you can't really talk about an individual. You can talk about a person, but a person might be made up of many different parts. Okay, there we go. So just explained that. It was through Marilyn Strathern's work that we get this idea. Okay, so here's a definition then, or a contrast of the Dividual and individual perspectives. The Dividual is considered to be divisible, comprising of a complex of separable, interrelated, but essentially independent dimensions or aspects. The individual, the Western model, is thus monadic, while the Dividual is fractal and multiple. The individual is atomistic, while the Dividual is always socially embedded. The individual is an autonomous social actor, the author of his or her own actions, while the Dividual is a heteronymous actor performing a culturally written script. The individual is a free agent, while the Dividual is determined by cultural structures. Okay, and the individual is egocentric, while the Dividual is sociocentric. So I've got a few examples of different social cultural contexts where these Dividual models of the self seem to be predominant. Okay, so for example, what it means to be a person in the Japanese sense cannot be understood without reference to the individual's social ties, the particular, usually tight and limited human nexus to which he or she belongs, from which one derives identity and to which one is totally committed. We're saying that, in Japanese culture, the self is a part of, family groups, that other members' relationships are just as important as the person, if that makes sense. You can't separate the person from the social group. Malays on the island of Langkawi become complete persons, that is kin, through living and consuming together in houses. So you only become a real person, or a fully developed person, through social interaction with other people. There's also this idea in here that the self isn't something that is permanent or, kind of like unchanging, but actually that the self is more like a process that changes over time. So again, identity and substance are mutable and fluid. These perceptions suggest a processual view of kinship and personhood. So for the Malay people then, Malaysians, the person is something that develops over time. It's not like you're born with an identity and then that stays with you all the way through your life. It's like it's understood as a process of, cumulative that builds up, basically. Okay, and here's another example. The concept of noman can be glossed variously as mind, intention, will, agency, social conscience, desire, or personality. It clearly covers a wide range of meanings. These meanings have to be seen processually in terms of the life cycle and of social interaction. So again, this is in terms of Melanesian people. They have this concept of noman, which is the, what we might call the self, essentially. But it's not a bounded sense of self, and it's not a static self. It's a dynamic processual self. But it's also interesting to say that, or to note that, these models of self, Western and non-Western selves, are not necessarily discrete. So it's not like that. You might find, for example, in Western society that there are some people still who possess, a Dividual model of the self for various different reasons. So the social psychologist Lillard, she suggested that this kind of area had been under-researched, the actual variability within a dominant culture in terms of the sense of self. So while you might be living in a dominant Western culture with this idea of an individual self, certain people might still possess this Dividual model through their experiences, maybe, or through their cultural background and things like that. So she says, while probably fairly accurate for the majority of people the majority of the time, this characterization of Euro-American folk psychology certainly has limitations. For example, religious beliefs, e.g. whether non-material sources like spirits or gods can directly influence one's mind, are a source of variation within Euro-American culture, but they are rarely considered in discussions of folk psychology. Okay, so beliefs about spirits, like for example, mediums, like in my own research, they seem to have more of this kind of Dividual, partible kind of model of a self, slightly different to the standard Western model, which is interesting. So what I've suggested then, in my thesis, but in other places as well, is that the self isn't a cultural category, although there is a cultural category, like Marcel Mauss said, like there is a cultural model, but actually the self itself is an experiential phenomenon, our inner understanding, which is why, we might grow up within a dominant culture and learn that the self is an individual, but then when we have certain kinds of experiences or paranormal dreams, anything, we sometimes push beyond that cultural model. Okay, so it's more to do with experience than the cultural models, and that's my main point in talking about this, that the self isn't just a cultural model, although there are cultural models, it's experiential. And that helps us to understand why individual people's models of the self can differ drastically from any kind of cultural model. It can include much more variety of things. Okay, so that's the anthropological circle on the Venn diagram. These two different models of the self. So, we grow up in the West thinking that the self is an individual thing, but actually when we look cross-culturally and when we look more deeply in our own culture, we see that the self might actually be multiple. And it might be experiential as well. So Arnie Naess then, this is the deep ecology circle on the Venn diagram. He was a philosopher. He was quite a mainstream sort of analytic philosopher to begin with, but he became increasingly involved in environmental philosophy. And he founded what came to be known as the deep ecology movement. And like I said, the deep ecology movement is about establishing a deep relationship with the natural world in order to overcome the ecological crises that we're facing. So you talked about a difference between deep ecology on the one hand, which is a total radical transformation of the self and of society and all that kind of stuff, and shallow ecology on the other side, which is just doing more recycling and switching to electric cars and that kind of thing. So for Arne Naess, the ecological self was something much deeper than any kind of just being concerned with recycling and that kind of stuff. And he suggested that it was through a process that he calls self-realization. So this is what I mean by the experiential self, of us gradually through a process realizing who we are and the extent of our minds and that kind of stuff, that we ultimately move away from the egoic, bounded individual model of the self, the Western self, towards what he called the ecological self. Okay. And the ecological self has many of the characteristics of the kinds of things that we've just been talking about with regard to the non-Western self. Yeah, it's porous, it contains elements outside of the body, like plants and trees might be incorporated as a part of the self, for example. So what he's really saying is that the ecological self of a person is that with which this person identifies. So he's saying that when we come to identify, our environment with ourselves, then we're starting to enter into this ecological consciousness, or ecological way of conceiving of itself. We're not individual and we're not bounded off from the world, but we're actually embedded in the world and fundamentally connected and related to it in different ways. Okay? It's also interesting that this idea of the ecological self is found in many, although we said it's found in non-Western societies, but particularly in sort of indigenous cultures, where indigenous people have cultures that are very much embedded into a particular environmental or ecological niche, and that is kind of a part of the self. It's their sustenance, their way of living, it's food, but it's also relationships. Okay, so there's lots of interesting overlaps and interesting things here. Okay, so he says then, the key sentence, he doesn't give a definition of the ecological self, but he does give a description, is that the self shifts the burden of clarification from the term self. So it's not about a concept of the self, but it's more to do with how we experience and identify, or how we process, how this process of identification takes place. Okay, so it's an experiential thing that can go beyond these cultural models that we were talking about. So it emerges then when we come to identify the environment with ourselves, essentially. And he's saying that if we did this, if more people in Western cultures, but in particular, because of the sort of our detachment from the environment in a lot of ways, if we realized our connection to it again, that we might be able to bring about some behavioral changes as well, which is his overarching idea. Okay, more recently, another definition of the ecological self comes from the philosopher Freya Matthews. Okay, and she talks about how this idea of the self, ourselves, how we have emerged through a process of evolution. So the self is embedded in nature. We're not separate from it in any way. And our psychology and all that stuff has evolved as well. So she talks about a holistic nesting of a self in a wider self system. So that we're all kind of interconnected in some ways. It means relative identification with that system. So same as Arne Naess was saying, we're embedded into our environments. And when we come to identify our environments with us, that's when we're entering into this ecological framework. She says, because the self stands in relations of ecological interdependence, direct or indirect, with the elements of that wider self, those elements or its relations to them are logically involved in its identity. So the ecological self expands out beyond the limitations of the physical body into the surrounding environment. Okay, so from this perspective, individuality is thus a relative matter. It's a function of involvement in a wider system, the identity of which is implicated in the identities of each of its participant subsystems. The individual is thus, in a very real sense, a microcosm of the wider self in which it occurs. So, you know, we're all kind of nodes, really, is what she's saying, within this wider system, this wider ecological system. And when we come to realize that, which is what Arnie Naess was talking about, then we can change our behaviors, you know, we interact with it differently. Okay, we'll just look at one more definition of the ecological self from Joanna Macy. Okay. She's one of the leading theorists in eco-psychology. She says, once we tune into our interconnectedness, responsibility towards self and other become indistinguishable, because each thought and act affects the doer as much as the one done to. Okay, so again, it's about identification of the other as a part of the self. Just as an amputee continues to feel twinges in the severed limb, so in a sense do we experience in anguish for homeless people or hunted whales, pain that belongs to a separated part of our body, a larger body than we thought we had, unbounded by our skin. So we start to think about the self in terms of this larger body. Well, we're starting to move into, you know, areas of parapsychology and the paranormal, which is really cool. So a lot of you guys know probably about the history of psychical research and parapsychology, but, you know, just for the sake of completeness, the SPR was founded in 1882, and their role was, you know, the first in the world to adopt a scientific approach in its investigations of that large group of debatable phenomena designated by such terms as mesmeric, psychical, and spiritualistic. So they were the first people to take this scientific approach to the paranormal. The Ghost Club was slightly earlier, but whether they were applying a scientific approach is another matter. Then in the 1930s, psychical research kind of becomes professionalized, and it becomes laboratory-based with the work of people like J.B. Rhine and the Parapsychology Lab. So it moves from being a field-based research, psychical research, going out into the field and, you know, with mediums or whatever, haunted houses, into a laboratory experimental kind of condition. And I've talked elsewhere about how that shift in perspective has led to, you know, a dwindling in a way of psi effects, maybe, but also a loss of understanding of how the paranormal and these kinds of experiences manifest in the real flux of everyday life. But that's another issue, really. Okay, so it becomes a laboratory discipline. And then in 1969, the Parapsychological Association finally gets admitted into the American Academy of Sciences, largely due to the influence of the anthropologist Margaret Mead, which is interesting. She had an interest in parapsychology, and she'd done Xenocard experiments, and she used her, you know, clout to push the Parapsychological Association into the American Academy of Sciences. Okay, and parapsychology continues to this day, and it continues to produce challenging data. Okay, but I want to think back now to the early days of psychical research, and especially Frederic Myers. He was one of the co-founders of the SPR. He was a classicist as his background, but he was really a pioneer in the early days of psychology. And his models of psychology were very influential on people like Freud and Jung. You know, the big names in psychology actually received a lot of their inspiration from Frederic Myers and his work on mediumship and all sorts of other kinds of paranormal phenomena. Okay, so he was fascinated by all these different aspects of psychical research. He wrote about apparitions, mediumship, and his most famous book is, you know, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, which was published a year after his own death. Okay, and the interesting thing about his ideas about psychology is that they're very complex, not complicated, but complex. You know, that his idea of the mind wasn't as something that is simple or easy to understand, but it's actually multifaceted. He actually talked about a multiplex self. He said the self is multiplex. And, you know, William James, the philosopher, and again, another pioneer of the study of religious experience and the paranormal, referred to Frederic Myers' work as a Gothic psychology. I just love that. I love that idea. this Gothic psychology. Think of Gothic architecture. It's got all of the little twisty bits, and it's really complex, isn't it, when you look at it? Well, he's saying that this is how Myers' model of the mind was similarly complex. Yeah, and Myers called it a multiplex self. Okay, so here's a nice little quote from James describing this. He's talking about Myers and the people, his colleagues in the SPR. He says that they have this romanticist approach to psychology. He says their work is like going from classic to Gothic architecture, where few outlines are pure and where uncouth forms lurk in the shadows. A mass of mental phenomena are now seen in the shrubbery beyond the parapet. Fantastic, ignoble, hardly human, or frankly non-human, and this is an interesting feature, are some of these new candidates for psychological description. So he's saying that there are actually non-human parts, of psychology, which sounds a bit like some of the things we've just been talking about, the ecological self, and also the non-Western self. He goes on, the world of the mind is shown as something infinitely more complex than was suspected, and whatever beauties it may still possess, it has lost at any rate the beauty of academic neatness. So it's not easy to put into categories and compartmentalize into boxes and things. And he goes on, but despite the triumph of romanticism, psychologists as a rule have still some lingering prejudice in favor of the nobler simplicities. So, he's saying that Myers came up with this amazing, elaborate model of the self, an understanding of the self, but most mainstream psychologists are only interested in simple understanding. So, this is essentially going to get lost by the wayside, which is unfortunate. But in essence, his model of the self consisted of two tiers, basically. So he talked about the supraliminal. This is our waking state of consciousness. And then he also talked about the subliminal. It's actually Myers who introduces this term subliminal, which we're probably all familiar with from various different contexts. But the subliminal mind exists below the threshold of our awareness. And his argument was that all sorts of different kinds of paranormal experiences and things could be explained in terms of a bubbling up of the subconscious, of the subliminal mind into our supraliminal mind. So, in the form of dreams and that kind of thing. These might be instances where the subliminal bubbles up and enters into our awareness. Okay, but his point is that this subliminal mind is also potentially connected, to other minds. And this is kind of where Jung's idea of the collective unconscious starts, begins to bubble up from as well. There we go. So this idea influenced William James and Carl Jung, and also Freud as well with his theory of the unconscious mind. Okay, so here's Myers then. It says the conscious self of each of us, as we call it, the empirical, the supraliminal self, does not comprise the whole of the consciousness within us. There exists a far more comprehensive consciousness, a profounder faculty, which for the most part remains potential only so far as regards the life of Earth, but from which the consciousness and the faculty of Earth life are mere selections. So he's starting to draw in these broader, Earth life kind of themes as well into this idea of the self, which is really interesting. He says, I regard each man as at once profoundly unitary and almost infinitely composite, as inheriting from earthly ancestors a multiplex and colonial organism. So it's like we're made up of many different parts. Again, this is echoing that idea of the non-Western self, or of the deep, the ecological self. Okay, he calls this polyzoic and perhaps polypsychic in an extreme degree, but also as ruling and unifying that organism by a soul or spirit absolutely beyond our present analysis, a soul which has originated in a spiritual or metatherial environment. Really cool. Okay, just one more quote here from Myers. I mean no unreal opposition or forced divorcement of sacred and secular, of flesh and spirit. As our more fully through the individual cell, we shall feel love more ardent, wider wisdom, higher joy, perceiving that this organic unity of soul, which forms the inward aspect of the telepathic law, is in itself the order of the cosmos, the summation of things. So he's saying that actually the subliminal mind is kind of like, maybe the bedrock of all of this stuff. And it pours into living things. Okay, so we're moving into some interesting territory there. Very forward-thinking territory as well. More recently, parapsychologists have also talked about this idea of the self, of a permeable self, and they've actually associated it with, higher functioning in psi experiments. So, CJ was saying before about boundary thinness and that kind of thing. Well, people who have this psychological characteristic of, of not perceiving necessarily a boundary between themselves and other things, again, linking to this idea of the ecological self, that they have better, scores in psi experiment. Okay, so this parapsychologist, William Broad, started to touch upon this idea and this relationship, not only of this idea of different kinds of selfhood, but also of the role that our cultural models of the self, as an individual, bounded, unique, kind of thing, might have had on the way that we experience the self. Okay, so he says, psi events suggest that these limited identities, the bounded Western self, may be quirks of an unnecessarily limited and habituated attention, self-perception and self-conception. Such an individual self-concept may be, to a large extent, culturally conditioned, because even without considering psi events, we can find in other cultures greater identification with others, which is what we've been talking about, with one's extended family, one's community, one's ancestors, with aspects of the natural world. Even within a Western Eurocentric culture, we experience expansions of self-identity beyond their usual bounds in certain non-ordinary conditions of consciousness. Psi experiences suggest even further and more profound extensions of identity. So he's saying actually the data from parapsychology suggests that self is more expansive than our cultural model. Okay, which is very interesting that this research is also highlighting that perhaps these indigenous models of the self might actually be more accurate models, maybe. Okay, so he says the psi phenomena that we observe in laboratory experiments appear to require and to reveal this interconnectedness. This connectedness seems more subtle, more extensive, and more profound than other more familiar conventional forms. So actually that we're most familiar with this bounded model of the self, but actually when we look at the data from parapsychology, it suggests that it's actually spread out more. That's some way of thinking about it, but it's not bounded by the physical body. Okay, and eco-psychologists have picked up on this similarity as well. So they've suggested that the human psyche is woven into nature in the same way that psi is interwoven into a larger emotional and physical context. So the mind is a part of nature in the same way that parapsychologists hypothesize that psi is somehow involved in our consciousness and all of that kind of thing. Okay, so just to finish off, I want to turn attention now to what actually this might mean, and I just want to mention William James's idea that you could tell if an experience was genuine, if a religious experience was genuine, if it had an impact on the person, if it had changed their life or if it changed their behavior in some way. And he called these the fruits of the experience. So he said, you'll know a religious experience by its fruits. If someone has been morally transformed, for example, then perhaps it was a real experience. So he was interested in the effect of the experience on the individual. So did it change their behavior? And it's interesting to note that there has been recognition of this change of behavior in all sorts of different kinds of, not just religious experiences, but other kinds of extraordinary experiences as well. So near-death experiences, for example. Ring and Valerino found that people who've had near-death experiences often come back with heightened sensitivity to the ecological health of the planet following their experiences. Okay, so they come back actually from these extraordinary experiences with what we might consider an ecological self. Okay, Other examples, similarly, lifetime experience with psychedelics in particular may contribute to people's pro-environmental behavior by changing their self-construal in terms of an incorporation of the natural world. So actually, you know, amongst people who use psychedelics, we also find these kinds of transformations of the self to incorporate elements from outside the body, you know, that we don't put the boundaries up anymore, which is very interesting. And we also see it in, of all places, alien abductions, which is good. So John Mack pointed this out back in the 90s. He said, it seems impossible to avoid the observation that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of a planetary ecological crisis that is reaching critical proportions, and that information about this situation is often powerfully conveyed by the alien beings to the experiencers. So again, he's saying, you know, alien abductees often come back from this renewed sense of urgency to do something about the environmental crisis, but also, you know, a renewed sense of connection to the other living things on the earth. So this is, you know, this begs for a little bit more research. But, you know, there's a couple of angles that we could take this in. You know, it could be the fact that having extraordinary experiences is essentially the same thing as entering into ecological consciousness. So it might be, you know, that having an extraordinary experience like taking psychedelics or having a near-death state of consciousness. And I thought about that in the past, you know, with alien abductions, because they're not very pleasant experiences. And I find it very hard to imagine why they might lead to a positive outcome like that. But I think actually it might be more to do with the fact that paranormal experiences themselves might be more common for people who are already experiencing this ecological consciousness, for people whose boundaries are already thin. So it's not necessarily that the experience causes the boundary thinness, but maybe, although I think probably they can do as well, but it may be that these people are already more boundary thin. And, you know, there is research to back up this idea as well. So it's very interesting, this connection between cultural models, pre-cultural models or pre-cultural experiences that challenge cultural models, and the fruits of these kinds of experiences, which all seem to lend themselves to this kind of ecological perspective. Okay, so I'll just summarize then. Anthropologists have recognized that there are different models of the self, and they've called these individual and dividual. This doesn't mean that you're not going to find dividual selfhood in Western contexts. So, for example, in subcultures, people who have different practices, you know, people who practice meditation, for example, might have a different concept of the self to the cultural models. Mediums, like I talked with, have very different models of the self. People who follow different religions may also have different conceptions of the self, and so on. So actually, maybe this idea of there being a Western self doesn't really work. It's actually much more varied. So the self, in fact, may be an experiential rather than a social or a cultural phenomenon. And that means that we learn about the self through our experiences. So if we have expanded experiences like psychedelic experiences or paranormal experiences, we incorporate that into our model of the self, and we realize then, you know, that perhaps the self extends beyond the body. Psychical researchers and parapsychologists have been investigating Dividual forms of consciousness, you know, in Western contexts for over 150 years. There's a whole load of interesting, got to be a whole load of interesting data in there that's ripe for cross-cultural comparison. Myers' multiplex self sounds similar to these models of the ecological self, but also to non-Western models of the self. Psi data implies that we are connected by these invisible networks, which may be some form of collective unconscious or subliminal mind kind of thing. But it also feeds into this ecological perspective of an interconnected cosmos. So, you know, we could ask, have parapsychologists been researching the ecological self all along? And have eco-psychologists been researching the multiplex self all along? Okay. And if this is the case, then it might help us, like we've just seen, to understand why one of the major effects or one of the major fruits of many different kinds of paranormal and extraordinary experiences is a sense of greater connection to the cosmos, because in those experiences, our boundaries are broken down in some way, sometimes in a pleasant way and sometimes not a pleasant way. But we experience that interconnection firsthand when our cultural models are shattered. So there we go. That's my talk. Here we go. The ecological self is this thing that unites these three different spheres of research. And here are some references if you want to follow up on anything. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So now over to the questions. Let's start then with me, as always, wittering at you. So I was going to ask you when we were going to get into psychedelics, because back in the 80s I looked at psychedelic drugs and mysticism, a comparison of states of consciousness for my undergraduate dissertation. Not intentionally. Stanley Rudman, my head of department, came in one day and said, "Roma, what are you doing your dissertation on? You haven't given me a dissertation title." And I jokingly said, mainly